We're good to go.
Yeah.
All right. Hello, everyone. We are representatives from the SSU Garden, and our presentation is about agroecology, which we believe is a path towards social and environmental justice.
My name is Edgar Munoz, and I'm a third-year student here at Sonoma State, majoring in environmental science in the geography, environmental, and planning department. Yeah, would you like to introduce this?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Katie Hackmeyer. I'm the teacher in the agroecology garden. I'm also a commercial farmer here in Sonoma County, and do some other teaching outside of SSU and facilitation through Climate Farm School and Agroecology Commons, and do some community organizing with celebrating women's leadership in food.
And I'm Owen Stoltz. I am a graduating senior this semester, if all goes well. And I'm a steward at the garden. I also do some work through the Center for Environmental Inquiry, and I'm into kind of a restoration, ecological healing in our world and climate. Next slide. And we're here on behalf of the SSU Campus Garden. Now, I don't know if you guys knew that we had a garden on campus. It's tucked away by the Environmental Technology Center, which is on the northern end, kind of by, I believe Cabernet is the village there. It's just a small little garden. We probably have about 20 beds. It's fully organic. We implement lots of ecologically regenerative and sustainable practices. And we have, as a result, some of the best soil that I've seen across the entire campus. And it's a very wonderful place. The garden is host to a class, which Katie here is the professor for, called Agroecology in Action. It's GP 318. It's open to non-majors. So and if you guys are interested by the end of this, you are free to enroll this fall. And we grow a lot of organic vegetables and fruits and greens that we donate to Noah's Food Pantry, which is across the street from the high school down off of Snyder. And once a week, we give them a host of fresh vegetables and goods. I think we average around like 15 pounds on an off season, and we can get up to 20, 30 during the summer, during the heaviest growth. And it goes to a bunch of people who can't afford food, or I've heard from them that a lot of older people who are being taken care of by hospice nurses, they get a lot of our produce, and it is some of the the freshest and best tasting food that they can process at this time. So that's who we are and what the garden is.
Before we start to make a connection where between social and environmental justice, we kind of wanted to define what they were. And so social justice is defined as to create a fair and equal society between each individual's matter, and the rights to recognize and protect their own decisions, which are made in a fair and honest way. Environmental justice is defined as all people pretty much have the right to be surrounded by clean, healthy, and safe environments, to have equal access and safe and healthy workplaces and schools and recreation areas, and also to have access to a safe and nutritious food. And so with that, I feel like the connection that agroecology is able to make is that it all stems from sort of the systemic discrimination that promotes poverty, lack of housing, lack of healthcare, and the lack of food access. And something that agroecology tackles is, one of the main things that agroecology tackles is the food insecurity part of that. Environmental injustice was first coined or termed in the United States, actually, and that's traced back to the Jim Crow laws, which was around, I believe, the 1800s. So something that agroecology focuses on tackling is One of the many things is food insecurity. If you look over to the graph, you can see the disproportionality between people of color and people that identify themselves as white. This sort of difference is amplified during events of economic instability. We see this clearly in the Great Recessions to 2008, but we can also see it in the COVID pandemic and how that amplified this even more. And some of the other issues that agroecology tackles are things like food deserts, food apartheid, land and water contamination. I wanted to kind of tell a personal experience from the land and water contamination. I did a lot of work with community gardens back in LA, and specifically in areas of low-income communities. And I remember this one time we had access to this land that we wanted to grow food. And we started prepping and everything. We started planting, and we noticed that plants weren't really coming up. And so we did a test on the soil, and there was a pretty high content of metals in there. And it just goes to show you that not only is the injustice visually seen in the infrastructure, but also within the whole foundation of what our survival relies on, which is food. And so with that, agroecology kind of proposes a holistic approach to solving these issues, simply because whether it's an ecological, environmental, or systemic issue, they can't be separated. The image here shows the complexity that agroecology tackles and presents. Something that I would like to emphasize is the middle part of the image, where there's the synergies part. And all agroecology kind of presents this symbiotic way of approaching these issues. And Katie will be talking to us more about what agroecology is as a definition and the complexity that comes from that.
Yeah, so Edgar shared a little bit about what agroecology seeks to tackle, the kind of injustices that it seeks to tackle. And before we take a walk over to the garden and actually show you guys what we're doing on campus here in place, I'm just going to share a little bit about this, kind of address this question, what is agroecology, and give a little bit of kind of historical background and kind of systemic background, so we can really understand kind of the link between our food system, agroecology, and social and environmental injustices. So Miguel Altieri, who's an agroecological leader here in the US, defines agroecology as the application of ecological concepts and principles to the design and management of sustainable agroecosystems. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations actually kind of takes it a bit further and talks about agroecology as an integrated approach that simultaneously applies ecological and social concepts and principles to the design and management of food and agricultural systems, seeks to optimize the interactions between plants, animals, humans, and the environment, while taking into consideration the social aspects that need to be addressed for a sustainable and fair food system. So those are kind of like big definitions that integrate a lot of different things, but all of the different pieces are really important when we're talking about agroecology, because one of the things that's kind of the easiest to think of are specifically the ecological principles of agroecology, like applying ecological principles to an agroecosystem. But there are these other pieces that are really important in the foundations of agroecology that look at things like social inequity and embed them in our understanding of how we can transform the food system, or how we need to transform the food system. So we talk about, so agroecology is really big, is kind of the long and short of it. But we really talk about it as being a science, a methodology, and a movement. So as a science, It's the holistic study of agroecosystems, like Edgar mentioned, which brings together Indigenous and Western science, revalorizes Indigenous wisdom, centers land stewards as experts rather than just, scientists or Western identified scientists or academics as experts, but also people on the land are identified as experts. And not just experts, but participants in research that integrates physical, biological, social, political, and agronomic sciences. So as a science, it is integrating social and physical sciences, biological sciences, and it really leans on participatory action research. So research that is done between practitioners on the ground, together with and between practitioners on the ground and other experts coming in from different fields. So as a method and a practice, agroecology is kind of a set of principles and ecologically centered practices meant to increase the health, resiliency, and sustainability of farming systems and landscapes. So some of the, when we think of agroecology as a practice or a set of methods or a set of things to apply onto the land, we're talking about things that help us build soil, increase biodiversity, and conserve water. They're often the same principles that we hear talked about in things like regenerative agriculture or sustainable agriculture, or a long time ago, organic agriculture. All of those, all of that rhetoric and all of that language really kind of leans on and is based on Indigenous land stewardship principles. And so it's really important to remember that when we hear some of this language around things like regenerative agriculture, if that sounds familiar to folks, that we want to be careful not to forget that we need to recognize that the roots of that are in Indigenous land practices and Indigenous land stewardship ethics. These principles also really help us sequester carbon in the soil and grow nutrient-dense food. So when we're building healthy soil, we're inherently, and we won't get into the nitty-gritty of this because we don't have time, but when we're building healthy soil and when we're increasing biodiversity, both above ground and below ground, we're inherently sequestering carbon. And so agroecology is being looked to globally as kind of a key way that we can use our agricultural lands to help mitigate climate change, which is a really important thing for us all to be thinking about, obviously. Now, again, this is sometimes the easiest place to kind of focus our attention because it can be very cut and dry. Like these are good practices. These are things we can implement. We can understand them. We can do this. But it's really important to remember that agroecology is also a social movement. So as a social movement, its roots are in Latin America. And as a social movement, it really seeks to recenter food and agriculture in society. It seeks to revalorize peasant foodways and transform the food system to center equity, justice, and food sovereignty. Food sovereignty is the notion that people have a right to define their own food systems versus corporations having the power to define our food systems, and people and communities also having rights to the means of production like land, water, and seeds. So agroecology really works often in tandem with the food sovereignty movement, which is a movement that also has kind of its roots in Latin America, Africa, and Europe, and that we're hearing more about it in North America now. So when we talk about the ways that agroecology is really seeking to transform the food system, there are some important things to point out that have to do with kind of the deep history of inequity within the food system. So a lot of times you'll hear people talk about the food system being broken and how we need to fix the food system. And in agroecology, we kind of recognize the food system itself is not broken, because the food system itself is actually functioning exactly as it was meant to function from its historical roots. It is not functioning in a way that serves people. Many, many, many people, billions of people around the world are not served by the current food system. There's 1 billion hungry people, roughly 1 billion hungry people, 1 billion micronutrient deficient people, 1 billion people suffering from obesity. Half the world's population is not being served by the food system, just to speak of personal health, not things like ecological health. But that food system is functioning as it was set to function here in the United States. And that is because upon colonization and the founding of the United States and the building of a capitalist economy, the food system and plantation economics were very much at the heart of that. So the food system itself helped build capitalism in the United States, and the food system and capitalism were very much entwined with one another and how they function and how they function. And in a capitalist society, much of the time, the way that things are meant to function is to increase profits for particular people, not necessarily to democratically serve all people. And most importantly, the foundations of our food system here in the United States was very explicitly built from the ground up upon colonization on oppression and inequity. So talking about the history of the food system can be sticky and uncomfortable, but it's a conversation that I think we have to have very explicitly so we can actually address the issues at hand. And it's important for us to recognize that our entire food system was built on the theft of human beings and the enslavement of human beings, the theft of people, skills, knowledge, and expertise from Africa and their enslavement in the United States, what became the United States, and the theft of land from the indigenous people that, that lived here on this landmass. So it's very foundations, the labor, the land, how the entire economic system around it were built, were essentially racist and unjust from the ground up. And we see those foundational realities persisting today in many, many different ways in the food system. We see it persisting in farm worker and food worker conditions. We see it persisting internationally with land grabbing, domestically and internationally with land grabbing. We see it in food apartheid around American cities, or what sometimes is called a food desert, a place where there's not access to grocery stores. In the food sovereignty and agroecology movements, we call it food apartheid because a desert is a naturally occurring ecosystem. Apartheid is something that is done to a place, which is what's happening in our American cities. We see it in the hunger statistics and demographics in America and around the world, the chart that Agro showed earlier. We see it persisting in the ecological destruction of industrial agricultural practices and the exporting of those practices around the world. We see it in international treaties that privilege Western countries to the detriment of countries in the global South or the majority world. And those repercussions, the repercussions of US agricultural history, persist more broadly in the United States when we look at the racial wealth gap. So according to the article, What the US Really Owes Black America by Jeff Newman and Tracy Matsu-Loafelotes, the 40 acres and a mule that were promised to freed Black families by General Sherman, that was then overturned by President Johnson, would have been worth $6.4 trillion in today's dollars. That coupled with the fact that in 1910, so a little over 100 years ago, Black farmers owned around 15 million acres of land, which was around 15% of the agricultural land at the time. Over the next 100 years, due to both direct white supremacist violence and also due to discriminatory policies and lending practices on the part of the United States Department of Agriculture, roughly 90% of that land was lost. So between the reparations that were owed, and in some small way, 40 acres and a mule really would have compensated for that, arguably definitely not. Between the loss of wealth that could have been generated from that, 40 acres and a mule had actually gone to newly freed families. And if the agricultural land that was once owned by Black families around the United States was not stripped from them because of white supremacist violence, the generational wealth that would have been earned would have created a much different landscape in the United States, because land and housing are land and home ownership are two of the primary ways to create generational wealth. So when that was stripped back in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, that set the stage, that agricultural history, that land not being transferred the way it should have been, and then being transferred away in a way it shouldn't have been, stripped the potential for intergenerational wealth that is reflected today in the wealth gap that we see in the United States. Does that make sense? So in knowing that and understanding that we cannot separate our agricultural history from our present day racial wealth gap and from the racist economics within the American ecosystem. So you can't disentangle equity and social justice from the food system or from our entire society, but you cannot disentangle it from talking about the food system, right? They are absolutely wrapped up in one another. And so the food system then becomes a very tangible place to take action and to enact transformation, which is what agroecology is looking to do, both ecologically and socially. So, you know, we kind of start our conversation in our agroecology class thinking about the idea of whether or not food is a privilege. Healthy, nutrient dense, culturally appropriate food is a privilege and a commodity, which is kind of how it exists in our capitalist system today, or whether it's a basic human right. That's kind of the place where we can start that question. And if we have a clear answer with that, it changes the way we think about the food system and what needs to transform in the food system. And agroecology can be a part of that transformative solution. And what's important to point out, the last thing I'll point out is that agroecology is not about going back to some idyllic time, because as I just explained, that did not exist here in the United States, right? We're not talking about, because I think there's an easy way to be like, we need to go back to like the old ways, like before machinery, and like, you know, get back to the good old land-based days. And we're not talking about that, because that period of time actually didn't exist in the United States. So what we're talking about is creating something new together. Something that brings together Western science and indigenous knowledge, and that brings together the peasant food web, and that kind of reconsiders food in society in general, and really seeks to democratize the food system in a new way. And the way that I also like to help my students think about it, because that is all huge, right? Like that's like, how do we like overturn capitalism or change capitalism completely? How do we change our entire food system, which is, you know, very deeply entrenched over the last 150 years. But I would say, like, you know, not thousands of years. Like we're much more, our industrial agricultural system is much smaller in time than a system that existed before that, or that exists in other places in the world. But what we need to do is kind of think about where we're setting our North Star, because it's a big thing to tackle, and a lot of huge changes that are necessary. So what we can do is set our North Star as far as we can possibly imagine, so that it keeps pulling us along on that path to change. And even if things seem impossible, don't bring that North Star in, because it's going to limit how far we can actually go. And continuing, I think agroecology really calls us to continue setting that North Star as far as we can imagine it, in the most transformative way that we can imagine it. And with that, I'll turn it back over to, I don't know if they even actually told you guys, these guys are the garden stewards in the agroecology garden. So they've both taken the agroecology class, and now they're two of the primary stewards who have internships in the garden and work there. And they're going to dive more deeply into their stories with the garden.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, I did a good amount of work volunteering in LA with creating community gardens in low-income areas. And I was initially studying architecture at Mount San Antonio College, a community college. But then I wanted to get out of LA, and I transferred here to Sonoma State. The closest thing that they had to architecture was the planning courses here offered, and that was in the geography, environments, and planning. And I initially started to dig into like what was going around food systems at school. And so I stumbled upon the garden, volunteered a good amount of times. And yeah, I just really enjoyed it. I think it connected me back to my childhood growing up in Mexico, and my grandma growing all of the food that we needed. And that was really good for me to kind of align myself to the purpose of what I am trying to do.
My background isn't, I didn't come from explicitly food systems and food production background. I started pre-pandemic as a sociology major. So I was kind of stewing in these systems theories and inequality and all this stuff. And I don't know if you guys have taken a sociology class before, but they're very depressing. And they like really make you think about the state of our society and how everything just feels broken. And then the pandemic hit. So I got to go home, and I took 2 gap semesters, and I got to just think about that. And I thought, and I thought, and I thought, and the more I thought about it, the more I thought about these top-down solutions that often get brought up when talking about these kind of issues. And I come to realize that a top-down solution often cannot solve a top-down problem. And so I approached it from the other angle and thought about grassroots movements and stuff that came from the bottom up in order to enact change. And in order for a grassroots movement to have any sort of potency, it needs to be self-sufficient to a degree. It needs to be resilient and able to withstand external pressures to a large degree. And what that means on a human level is what I realize is food production. I don't know if you guys remember a couple of years back, there was a big winter snowstorm in Texas and the entire grid in Texas went down for weeks. And that was kind of a scary moment because it made me realize that if something similar like that happened in California, there would no longer be food in the grocery shelves. And then I realized that if that was the case and there wasn't food for weeks, I would simply starve, and all the people I cared about would as well. And so I really started diving headfirst into these food systems because it feels as such an integral part of human existence. And it is, as Edgar kind of alluded to earlier, like a big portion of the foundation on which we base our existence and our society at large. And so I transferred into the GEP department, which is more environmentally based trains of thought, more holistic thinking. And I signed up for Katie's agroecology class and I got my hands in the dirt, and I was extremely happy to do so. And that semester I was fortunate enough to have the timing where the previous steward was leaving and they needed a replacement. And Edgar and I happened to be the two people who stood up and said, yeah, like I like to play in this dirt, let's get in there. And so we got hired, and for about a year now I've been working at the garden, and it has been a very wonderful experience. It feels so nice to be connected to a place. The garden isn't mine. I don't own it. It doesn't belong to me. But when I'm there, I feel a sense of belonging and familiarity that is very valuable. And I think it's something that a lot of people are missing in their lives. Yeah, you have your home where you're comfortable and all that, but like to have a natural environment where you feel at peace and like you belong, that is something that's well worthwhile. And that's something that I found in the garden, and working in these food systems and like involving yourself in these environments gets you to that point much quicker. And it is even better than the food you can harvest from it, is that mental well-being. And I believe if we're ready, I'd like to share that all with you, that space of mine. And we're going to take a little field trip. We're going to have fun. It's a beautiful day out. We're going to go walk over to the garden. I don't know if any of you guys have ever been there before, but we're going to take a little journey. On the way, it is about like a 7 to 10 minute walk. So if you guys have any questions about what we've talked about, I know there's been a lot, feel free to ask us in transit. And then once we get to the garden, we'll show you around our little place. We're all ready to get on going.
It's probably only 5 minutes. Don't be intimidated by the walk.